Somewhere along the way, you absorbed a story about yourself, not a story you chose, not one anyone sat you down and explained, just one that seeped in through 1,000 small signals. Advertisements, offhand comments, the way culture frames men over 40. The story goes something like this: you had your window, and now it's closing. Attraction is a young man's game, and the best you can do from here is maintain, manage, and quietly accept the math. Most men never question that story, they just live inside it. And the cost of living inside it is subtle but serious. It shows up as the man who stops initiating, who assumes the outcome before anything has even begun, who invests less in himself not out of laziness, but out of a quiet, unspoken conviction that the return simply isn't there anymore. It looks like resignation dressed up as realism. Here is where that story breaks down. The decline narrative borrows its logic from a very specific and very narrow model of what makes a man attractive. It's a model built almost entirely around surface signals: physical peak, social performance, the restless energy of someone who hasn't yet figured out who he is. That model made a kind of sense at 22, but it was never the full picture. It was just the loudest part of the picture at the time. What no one tells you, and what the research and lived experience of women consistently reflects, is that the qualities most deeply connected to sustained attraction are not the ones that peak at 25 and erode. They are the ones that don't even begin to develop until a man has been through something, until he has failed at something that mattered, until he has learned to sit with himself without needing the room to validate him. The decline narrative isn't lying about everything. Some things do change with age, but it is profoundly wrong about which things matter. So the real question isn't how to compete with who you were at 30. The real question is whether you understand what you've actually become, and whether you've learned to carry it correctly. Because that answer changes everything. The model of attraction most men are working from was built by observing 19-year-olds. That's not an exaggeration. The cultural blueprint the majority of men internalized during their formative years was assembled from the most visible, most loudly rewarded signals in a high school hallway or a college party. Physical dominance, social proof, the ability to hold a room's attention, the confidence that comes not from self-knowledge, but from not yet having experienced enough failure to doubt yourself. That model isn't worthless, but it is incomplete in ways that cost men enormously as they get older. What women actually respond to at any age, but especially as they themselves mature, is far less about optics and far more about orientation. Not how you look standing still, but how you move through a room. Not what you say, but what you don't need to say. Not the performance of confidence, but the absence of the anxiety that makes performance necessary in the first place. Presence is the word that comes closest, though it gets used so often it has nearly lost its meaning. What it actually describes is a man who is fully occupying his own life, not distracted by how he's being perceived, not mentally rehearsing his next line, not scanning for approval in the subtle shifts of someone else's expression. A man who is simply, genuinely there. That quality is rarer than it sounds, and women feel its absence immediately, even when they can't name what's missing. Emotional steadiness is the second quality, and it is deeply misunderstood. It is not emotional flatness. It is not the old masculine archetype of detachment and unavailability. What it actually means is that your internal state is not held hostage by external circumstances, that you can sit with tension without immediately trying to resolve it, that you can receive someone's emotional reality without either drowning in it or retreating from it. That is not coldness, that is regulation. And for a woman who has spent years around men who either shut down or escalate, it registers as something close to relief. Then there is what might be called unspoken authority, not the performance of status, not the rehearsed projection of importance, but the simple, grounded sense that a man knows who he is and has stopped seeking permission to be that. It communicates through consistency, through the gap between what he says and whether he actually means it being very small, through decisions made from a clear internal compass, rather than the need to be liked, approved of, or seen as impressive. These qualities, presence, steadiness, and quiet authority, are not things you can fake across any meaningful length of time. Youth can simulate them briefly. Charisma can borrow their surface. But the real versions are built through years of self-examination, failure, and the kind of hard-won clarity that only comes when a man has stopped running from himself. Which raises an honest and uncomfortable question. If age is precisely the condition under which these qualities develop, why do so many older men fail to embody them? That is not a small question, and the answer to it matters more than most men want to admit. There is a particular kind of man you have probably encountered at some point in your life. He is not necessarily the loudest person in the room. He is not performing. He does not appear to be trying to establish anything. And yet something about him commands attention in a way that has nothing to do with looks or wealth or the conventional markers of status. People lean toward him slightly when he speaks. Women become more careful with their words around him, not out of intimidation, but out of a strange, instinctive sense that he is actually listening, that he will actually remember, that something real is happening in the exchange. That man did not arrive at that quality through genetics or luck. He arrived there through accumulation. The first thing age builds, when a man allows it to, is genuine emotional regulation, not suppression, not the brittle stoicism that passes for strength in men who are simply afraid of their own interior. Real regulation means you have been inside enough difficult emotional experiences to know that you will survive them. That anger doesn't have to become action. That discomfort doesn't have to become distance. That you can feel the full weight of something without being controlled by it. Young men intellectually understand this. Older men who have done the work actually live it. The difference is visible in every interaction, even the brief ones. The second quality is the absence of neediness, and this one is worth sitting with because it is more nuanced than it first appears. Neediness is not about wanting connection. Every healthy human being wants connection. Neediness is specifically the condition of requiring a particular response from another person in order to feel secure in yourself. It is the subtle desperation that leaks into pursuit, into conversation, into the way a man monitors whether a woman is still interested every 30 seconds. Age paired with self-awareness tends to dissolve this, not because the man stops caring, but because he has developed enough of a foundation inside himself that his sense of worth is no longer contingent on constant external confirmation. Depth of perspective is the third quality, and it is perhaps the most quietly powerful. A man in his 40s or 50s has watched things he was certain about turn out to be wrong. He has held convictions with total confidence and then had life revise them. That process, if a man doesn't become bitter or closed from it, produces something extraordinarily rare, the ability to hold complexity without needing to resolve it prematurely. He can sit with ambiguity, he can acknowledge what he doesn't know, and paradoxically, that intellectual humility reads as more authoritative than the rigid certainty of someone who hasn't yet been tested. Then there is comfort with silence. Not awkward silence, not punishing silence, but the simple ease of a man who does not need to fill every moment with noise in order to feel safe. In a world of constant performance and restless self-promotion, a man who can be genuinely quiet without tension is immediately distinct. It signals that he is not afraid of what the quiet might reveal. And finally, there is the capacity to make another person feel genuinely seen, not flattered, not assessed, actually seen. This comes only from years of paying real attention to people, from developing enough self-security that you can focus outward without an agenda distorting your perception. These are not small things. They are in many ways the deepest things. And here is the uncomfortable truth that has to follow them. Age creates the conditions for all of this, but it does not deliver any of it automatically. Two men, same age, same general landscape of experience, careers built, relationships navigated, losses absorbed, decades lived. One of them walks into a room and something shifts slightly in his favor. People respond to him. Women notice him in the way that has nothing to do with conventional attractiveness. He carries himself like a man who has been through things and came out clearer on the other side. The other man walks into the same room and registers as background. Not because he is less intelligent or less accomplished, but because somewhere along the way, the weight of his experience settled into him as burden rather than depth. That gap is not mysterious, it is psychological, and it is far more common than most men want to acknowledge. The first and most corrosive trap is bitterness. It is also the most understandable one, which is part of what makes it so dangerous. A man who has been through a difficult divorce, a career that didn't unfold as promised, a culture that seems increasingly indifferent to men of his generation. That man has genuine grievances. The problem is not that he feels them. The problem is when those grievances calcify into a fixed lens through which every new experience gets filtered. Bitterness reads on a man the way rust reads on metal. It is the visible evidence of exposure without protection. And no matter how justified it feels internally, externally, it functions as repellent. The second trap is emotional withdrawal. This one often masquerades as wisdom. The man tells himself he has simply learned not to invest too heavily, not to be naive, not to make the mistakes of his younger years. What he has actually done is built a perimeter. He is present in the technical sense, but unreachable in any meaningful one. And women who are extraordinarily sensitive to the difference between a man who is choosing his moments and a man who is simply unavailable feel that perimeter immediately. Guardedness and groundedness are not the same thing, but they are easy to confuse from the inside. The third trap is arrested identity. This is the man who stopped updating his own self-concept at some point in the past and has been coasting on that fixed image ever since. He knows who he was. He is less certain about who he is now, and rather than sit with that uncertainty and let it sharpen him, he avoids it. He keeps the same references, the same opinions, the same posture toward the world that he developed 20 years ago. Identity, like muscle, requires resistance to stay functional. Without ongoing challenge and revision, it stiffens. And then there is the comfort of invisibility. Some men, exhausted by years of striving and performing and trying to be seen, simply step back from the field entirely. They tell themselves they are content. Sometimes they genuinely are. But often invisibility is not peace. It is surrender, dressed in the language of acceptance. None of this is about shame. Every one of these traps is a completely human response to a genuinely difficult set of experiences. But a diagnosis is only useful if it leads somewhere, and that brings the question into focus with real precision. What specifically separates the men who carry age well from the men who don't? Everything discussed in this video, the presence, the steadiness, the depth, the capacity to make someone feel genuinely seen, traces back to a single internal change, not a habit, not a routine, not a set of behaviors to practice in front of a mirror. One fundamental reorientation in how a man relates to himself and to the people around him. The shift is this, from seeking approval to generating presence. It sounds simple. It is not. Seeking approval is not a character flaw, and it is not a weakness unique to insecure men. It is a deeply human orientation that most men were never given a reason to examine, because for a long time it was working well enough. In your 20s and 30s, the approval-seeking architecture mostly held. You performed, you were rewarded, the feedback loop functioned. But at some point, the scaffolding starts to show, and a man who is still fundamentally organized around the question of how he is landing with other people carries that question into every room, every conversation, every interaction. It is exhausting to be around, even when it is invisible to him. Generating presence operates from a completely different internal position. It is not indifference to others. It is not the performance of not caring, which is just approval seeking wearing a different costume. It is the genuine condition of a man who has developed enough of a relationship with himself that he no longer needs the external world to complete the sentence. He brings something into the room rather than waiting to see what the room will give him. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, restructures everything downstream. How he speaks, how he listens, how he pursues, how he handles rejection, how he occupies his own life. This is what the opening myth gets most catastrophically wrong. It measures male attractiveness as a quantity that depletes. But presence is not a quantity, it is a quality. And unlike muscle mass or reaction time, it does not have a biological ceiling that arrives at 40 or 50. It deepens with age in the men who choose to let it. You are handed a story about yourself, a story about windows closing and relevance fading and the best years sitting somewhere behind you. That story was never the whole truth. It was just the loudest version available at the time. The quieter version is more accurate, and it has been waiting for you to hear it.